I realized my family had stopped seeing me as a grandmother the moment my daughter-in-law raised her glass and turned me into a punchline. It was supposed to be a simple birthday lunch for my grandson Noah's 10th birthday, held at a quiet country club just outside Cedar Grove, where the dining room overlooked a soft green golf course that stretched for what looked like half a mile under the mild April sun. The tables were covered in cream linen, the kind that always makes a place feel more formal than it really is, and the servers moved quietly between chairs carrying iced tea and lemonade in tall glasses that left little rings of water on the polished wood. I had arrived 15 minutes early like I always did, carrying a neatly wrapped gift and a card I'd spent too long choosing because I still believed that the small details of family mattered. My son Daniel was already there with his wife Vanessa, sitting at the center of the long table where Noah was laughing with two friends from school, their voices bright and careless in the way only children's voices can be. Vanessa greeted me with that polished smile she used whenever other people were watching, the kind that showed perfect teeth but never quite reached her eyes. I kissed Noah on the top of his head, handed him the gift, and took the seat beside Claire Whitman, an old friend who had come along because she had known my late husband for nearly 40 years and still treated my family gatherings as if they were part of her own life. For while everything felt perfectly normal, plates of grilled chicken sandwiches arrived. The boys argued cheerfully about baseball teams, and Daniel talked about a project at work as if the whole afternoon were just another comfortable Sunday. I remember thinking that maybe the quiet tension I had sometimes felt around Vanessa over the past few years was something I had imagined. Maybe I was simply getting older, more sensitive to things that were never meant to hurt me. Then Vanessa stood up with her glass of sparkling water and tapped it lightly with her fork, the small clear sound cutting through the chatter until everyone at the table looked toward her. She smiled the way hosts do when they believe they are about to say something. "Charming. I just want to make a quick toast," she said lightly, her voice bright enough to carry across the table without ever sounding loud. Noah grinned, assuming it was about him, and Daniel leaned back in his chair as if the moment were completely harmless. Vanessa lifted her glass and turned slightly toward me, and for a second I felt the room grow oddly still, like the moment right before a breeze disappears on a warm afternoon. "To Noah," she said first, giving the expected part of the speech, and a few people nodded politely. Then she tilted her glass toward me and added with a laugh that sounded rehearsed, "And to the old lady who's going to keep funding this family tradition for years to come." A few people chuckled automatically because that's what people do when someone makes a joke at a table. Others looked down at their plates. I kept my smile exactly where it was, the same calm expression I had worn through countless social dinners over the decades. Because at 68 you learn that dignity is sometimes the only thing you truly control. The sunlight from the tall windows warmed the back of my chair while the ice in my glass shifted softly against the sides, and for a long second no one said anything at all. Vanessa laughed again as if she had delivered a clever line, and Daniel gave a small shrug that suggested it was all harmless fun. I lifted my own glass and nodded politely, the way you do when someone has just told a joke you don't quite understand but don't want to challenge. But inside my head, something quiet and precise clicked into place, the way the final piece of a puzzle settles after you've spent years ignoring the shape of the empty space. Because that was the moment I realized the joke wasn't really a joke at all. It was a summary. And from that moment on, I stopped being the generous grandmother everyone assumed I would always be, and I started paying attention to every word spoken at that table. The conversation around the table slowly returned to the easy noise that always follows a moment people pretend did not happen. Someone asked Noah about the video game he wanted for his birthday. One of his friends began describing a baseball tournament coming up in June. The server came by with another pitcher of iced tea and placed it gently between the plates as if nothing unusual had been said at all. I kept my hands folded loosely beside my glass and watched the sunlight sliding across the white tablecloth. From where I sat, I could see the golf course stretching beyond the wide dining room windows, a quiet green field rolling out for what must have been at least 200 yards before it disappeared behind a row of tall oak trees. The place smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh bread. It was the sort of peaceful, respectable room where families came to celebrate birthdays and anniversaries. That was what made the moment feel so strangely sharp. Vanessa began talking again, laughing easily as she cut a small piece of chicken from her sandwich. "Well, someone has to keep this tradition alive," she said lightly, glancing toward me again with that same polished smile. Daniel chuckled under his breath, as if the remark were harmless. "Mom has always been generous," he added, lifting his glass and taking a sip of iced tea without looking directly at me. The words sounded casual, almost affectionate, yet something about the way he said them carried the quiet certainty of a fact everyone at the table already accepted. I nodded politely, the same calm motion I had used 1,000 times over the years whenever someone complimented a meal or thanked me for bringing dessert to a holiday dinner. But inside my mind, the sentence settled differently. Generous. The word floated there like a label that had slowly replaced my name. Noah leaned across the table to show one of his friends the new watch he had received earlier that morning. The boys laughed loudly and compared the bright plastic bands as if they were discussing something priceless. Vanessa reached over and smoothed Noah's hair, then turned to Claire with a cheerful tone. "Kids grow up so fast," she said. "That is why we try to make these birthdays special every year." Claire smiled politely, though I noticed she did not answer right away. She glanced at me for half a second, the sort of quick look old friends exchange when they understand more than anyone else at the table realizes. Vanessa continued speaking, her voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone who had already decided how the story would be told. "It really does take a village to keep everything going," she added. "School activities, summer camps, sports equipment. It adds up quickly these days." Daniel nodded again. "That is true," he said, "but Mom has always believed family comes first." I took a small sip of iced tea. The glass was cold against my fingers. The ice shifted with a soft clink that sounded surprisingly loud to my ears. Family comes first. I had said those exact words many times in the past, usually while writing a check or quietly transferring money to help with something Daniel described as temporary. At the time, it had felt natural, the way a mother supports her child without keeping score. But as I sat there listening to the easy rhythm of their conversation, I noticed something I had not paid attention to before. Every example Vanessa mentioned had a price attached to it. School supplies, registration fees, equipment, trips. She listed them with the same casual tone people use when discussing the weather. And every time she spoke, her eyes drifted briefly in my direction, almost like someone glancing toward the person expected to pick up the bill. Across the table, Claire folded her napkin carefully on her lap and leaned slightly closer to me. "The cake looks beautiful," she said quietly, though the cake had not even arrived yet. I understood immediately that she was giving me an excuse to look away from Vanessa's bright, confident smile. I nodded and returned the polite comment, describing the bakery Daniel had chosen. The conversation moved on again. The boys began debating which movie they wanted to watch later. Vanessa laughed at one of their jokes and placed her hand lightly on Daniel's shoulder. Everything appeared normal to anyone who might have walked past the table at that moment. But the longer I listened, the clearer the pattern became. Each sentence carried the same quiet assumption, that I would always be there, that I would always help. That generosity was not something I offered, but something I owed. I set my glass down carefully beside my plate and looked around the table one more time. The sunlight had shifted slightly, brightening the silverware and the polished wood beneath the plates. The room was still calm, still elegant, still filled with the easy sounds of a family celebrating a child's birthday. Yet, the words Vanessa had spoken earlier remained hanging in the air like a truth no one intended to question. To them, it had been a joke. To me, it had become something else entirely. Because once you notice a pattern, you cannot pretend you do not see it anymore. I stayed at the table until the plates were cleared and the birthday cake finally arrived, tall and covered with blue frosting that Noah insisted looked like the ocean. The candles flickered gently in the soft air from the ceiling vents while the boys leaned forward with impatient smiles. Ready for the moment, everyone began singing. Vanessa stood beside Noah with her arm resting lightly around his shoulders, guiding the scene with the quiet authority of someone who liked to control the atmosphere of a room. Daniel pulled out his phone to record the moment, holding it steady as if this afternoon were one more perfect memory to store away. I clapped with everyone else when Noah blew out the candles, and I even laughed when one of the boys accidentally smeared frosting on his own cheek while reaching for the first slice. On the surface, everything looked exactly the way a family celebration should look. Yet the words Vanessa had spoken earlier lingered quietly in my mind, not loud or dramatic, just present in the way a small crack appears in a window long before anyone notices it spreading. While the cake was being cut, I began to watch more carefully than I had before. Vanessa handed the first slice to Noah, the second to Daniel, then passed another plate across the table toward Claire before finally setting one in front of me. "Do not worry," she said with an easy smile. "There is plenty for everyone." It was a harmless sentence, but the tone carried the same light confidence I had heard in her voice during the toast. Claire thanked her politely, though I noticed the way Claire's eyes briefly moved toward me again. The boys were busy comparing the toys they had received, and Daniel had begun telling a story about a client meeting earlier that week, something about a new office opening nearly 300 miles away in another state. I listened quietly, the fork resting in my hand while the frosting slowly softened on the plate. As Daniel spoke, Vanessa interrupted once or twice to add a detail about the cost of traveling back and forth or the price of gas these days, each comment delivered with a small laugh that made the words sound casual. "Everything adds up faster than people realize," she said at one point, shaking her head, as if the expenses of modern life were a shared burden everyone at the table understood. Daniel nodded again, the same easy agreement he had shown earlier. "That is why it helps to have family around," he replied. The sentence might have sounded warm to anyone else listening, but now that I was paying attention, I heard something else inside it, something unspoken but already accepted. Family around did not mean emotional support or companionship. It meant someone reliable enough to carry the weight when the bill appeared. I placed my fork down beside the plate and reached for my glass of iced tea, watching the ice cubes drift slowly toward one side as the glass tilted. The dining room had grown a little louder as other tables filled with afternoon guests. Somewhere behind me, a group of golfers laughed loudly about a missed shot, their voices echoing softly across the polished floor. The world outside our table continued exactly as it always had, calm and ordinary. Yet in that quiet moment, another memory rose in my mind, clear and simple. 3 years earlier, shortly after my husband passed away, Daniel had called one evening, sounding worried about Noah's private school tuition. Vanessa had explained that the school offered wonderful opportunities, but the tuition had increased again. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table in my house that night, the old oak table my husband had built himself decades earlier, and writing a check without hesitation because helping my grandson felt like the most natural thing in the world. A year after that, there had been summer camp, then new sports equipment, then a short family vacation Vanessa described as an important experience for Noah. Each time the request arrived, wrapped in gratitude and warm family language. Each time I helped gladly, never asking myself whether those moments of generosity were slowly turning into expectation. I looked around the table again now, noticing how comfortably the conversation moved forward as if nothing important had happened earlier. Vanessa laughed softly at something Daniel said. Noah had already finished his cake and was asking if he could open another gift when they got home. Claire remained quiet, gently folding her napkin beside her plate. The pattern in my mind grew clearer with every passing second. Vanessa had not made a careless joke during the toast. She had spoken with the relaxed certainty of someone describing a role that had already been assigned. And perhaps the most surprising realization of all was not that she believed it. It was that everyone else at the table seemed perfectly comfortable letting her believe it. After the plates were cleared and the last crumbs of blue frosting disappeared from the table, the birthday lunch slowly dissolved into that quiet moment when a celebration begins to end. The boys were already asking Daniel if they could walk outside to look at the small pond near the edge of the golf course, their voices bright with the restless energy only 10-year-old boys seemed to carry in unlimited supply. Vanessa agreed with a quick smile and reminded Noah not to run near the water. Daniel stood up, stretching slightly, and followed them out toward the patio doors, his phone still in his hand, as if he were ready to capture one more cheerful photograph. Claire and I remained at the table for a moment longer while the server collected the empty plates and replaced them with small folded checks inside leather folders. The room had grown quieter now, the lunch crowd thinning as the afternoon moved closer to 3 o'clock. Through the tall windows, I could see the boys standing near the water about 40 yards away, pointing at something in the grass, while Daniel leaned casually against the wooden railing behind them. Vanessa was still inside, standing near the host station, speaking with one of the waiters about the cake box. Claire reached for her purse and then paused, glancing toward the door Vanessa had just walked through. "You handled that very gracefully," she said softly. I knew immediately she was not talking about the cake or the lunch or any of the small, ordinary details that had filled the last 2 hours. Claire had always been the sort of person who noticed what others preferred to ignore. I gave a small smile and folded my napkin neatly on the table. "There was no reason to make a scene at a child's birthday," I replied. Claire studied my face for a moment with the thoughtful expression she used whenever she was deciding how honest to be. "It was not really a joke," she said quietly. The sentence was simple, yet it carried the weight of someone confirming something I had already begun to understand myself. I looked toward the windows where Noah was laughing loudly with his friends. The sunlight reflected brightly off the water, turning the small pond into a sheet of white light that made it difficult to see the far bank. "No," I said after a moment. "It was not." Claire nodded once, almost to herself. "I have heard Vanessa say things like that before," she continued, her voice still calm and careful. "Not exactly those words, but the same idea." I turned slightly toward her. "Where?" Claire hesitated for just a second, then spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided honesty was the better choice. "Last fall at the charity auction downtown," she said. She was talking with 2 women near the bar. They were discussing school tuition, and one of them joked about needing a miracle to afford private school. Vanessa laughed and said something about how she was lucky because you always stepped in whenever things became expensive. Claire paused again and then added, "She said it as if it were simply part of how your family works." The words did not shock me as much as they might have a year earlier. Instead, they slid gently into the growing pattern already forming in my mind. I remembered the quiet requests that had arrived over the years. Always polite, always temporary, always framed as something that would help Noah. I had never thought of those moments as a system. They had felt like individual acts of love. Claire watched me carefully, perhaps expecting anger or embarrassment. Instead, I found myself studying the sunlight moving slowly across the empty plates on the table. The reflection from the window had shifted a few inches, touching the silver fork beside my glass. "I suppose it means the role has been clearly defined," I said calmly. Claire leaned back slightly in her chair. "You're not upset?" she asked. I considered the question for a moment before answering. Upset was not the right word. Upset suggested surprise. What I felt instead was something quieter and far more useful. Clarity. "No," I said finally. "I think I'm simply paying attention now." Claire gave a small, thoughtful nod, as if she understood more than she intended to say out loud. Outside the window, Noah and the other boys had begun tossing small stones into the pond, each splash followed by a burst of laughter. Daniel watched them with an easy smile, completely unaware of the conversation happening inside. Vanessa returned to the table a moment later, carrying the white cake box in both hands. "They packed the rest for Noah to take home," she said brightly. Her voice was cheerful, confident, perfectly normal. The same voice that had delivered the toast earlier with such effortless certainty. I looked at her for a second longer than usual, noticing the relaxed way she held herself, the comfortable assumption that the afternoon had gone exactly as planned. In that quiet moment, another thought settled firmly into place in my mind. Vanessa had not simply believed I would always help. She believed it so completely that she no longer felt the need to hide the expectation at all. And the most interesting part was not that she believed it. The most interesting part was that she had never once considered the possibility that someday I might decide otherwise. The boys came back inside a few minutes later with the restless energy that always follows fresh air and too much birthday cake, their sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor as they rushed toward the table, where the wrapped gifts had been stacked earlier. Noah was still smiling, his cheeks slightly red from the sun outside, and he immediately began telling Vanessa about a turtle they thought they saw near the edge of the pond. Vanessa listened with a bright, attentive expression, nodding as if every detail were the most important story she had heard all day. Daniel followed them in more slowly, brushing a bit of dust from the sleeve of his jacket before reaching for the white cake box Vanessa had placed near the end of the table. The afternoon light had shifted again while we were sitting there, stretching longer shadows across the floor and turning the windows into wide mirrors reflecting the quiet room behind us. I stood up and adjusted my purse on my shoulder, preparing to leave, because the natural rhythm of a gathering had clearly reached its final moment. Claire had already said her goodbyes to the boys and was waiting near the entrance, her coat folded neatly over her arm. "Thank you for coming, Mom," Daniel said as he stepped toward me, giving me a brief hug that lasted exactly the right number of seconds to appear warm without becoming uncomfortable. Vanessa smiled and added, "We really appreciate everything you do for Noah." The sentence was delivered with the same easy tone she had used all afternoon. Yet now that I was listening closely, the words carried a quiet certainty that felt almost rehearsed. I returned the smile politely and told Noah I hoped he enjoyed his presents, promising to call him later in the week. The boys were already arguing about which toy to open first, their attention moving forward the way children always do, completely unaware of the subtle currents that shape the world around them. Outside in the parking lot, the air had cooled slightly, carrying the faint scent of cut grass from the golf course. Claire and I walked slowly toward our cars parked about 20 yards apart along the far row. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The late afternoon sun hung low above the trees, casting long golden shadows across the asphalt. Finally, Claire stopped beside my car and turned toward me with that thoughtful expression she had worn earlier inside the dining room. "You were thinking about it," she said quietly. It was not really a question. I rested one hand on the roof of the car and looked back toward the clubhouse entrance where Daniel and Vanessa were helping Noah gather the gifts into the trunk of their vehicle. From a distance, they looked like any other happy family, finishing a pleasant day together. "Yes," I answered calmly. "I am." Claire hesitated before speaking again. "What will you do?" she asked. The question lingered in the warm air between us for a moment. For years, the answer would have been obvious. I would have continued doing what I had always done. I would have written another check when the next expense appeared. I would have smiled and assured everyone that family came first. Yet standing there in the quiet parking lot, I realized something important had shifted inside me during the past 2 hours. The pattern was no longer invisible. And once you see a pattern clearly, pretending not to see it becomes impossible. "Nothing dramatic," I said after a moment. Claire watched my face carefully as if she were trying to read a page of a book written in very small print. "But something will change," she said. I opened the car door and placed my purse inside before answering. "Yes," I replied simply. "Something will." Claire nodded slowly, as though she understood more than I had actually said. We exchanged a quick goodbye, and she walked toward her own car. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, looking once more toward the family gathered near the trunk of Daniel's sedan. Vanessa was laughing about something Noah had said, her posture relaxed and confident, her movements carrying the calm assurance of someone who believed the future would unfold exactly as expected. I did not feel angry watching her. In fact, the emotion that settled over me was surprisingly quiet. It was the same feeling I remembered from years ago when my husband and I once discovered a small leak beneath the kitchen sink. The water had been dripping slowly for months without either of us noticing. When we finally saw the pattern of damp wood beneath the cabinet, the solution had not been shouting or panic. The solution had been simple. You turn the valve. You stop the flow. I started the engine and eased the car out of the parking space, the tires rolling slowly across the warm pavement. As I drove past the clubhouse entrance, Vanessa glanced up and waved with an easy smile, completely certain that everything between us remained exactly the same as it had been that morning. And perhaps in her mind it did, because the most powerful changes in a family do not always begin with loud arguments or dramatic announcements. Sometimes they begin quietly, inside the mind of the one person everyone assumed would never change at all. I drove home that afternoon along the same quiet two-lane road I had taken hundreds of times before, the late sun stretching across the windshield while long rows of maple trees cast slow-moving shadows over the pavement. My house sat just outside town on a small piece of land my husband and I had bought more than 30 years earlier when Daniel was still in middle school and needed a place to ride his bike without worrying about traffic. The gravel driveway crunched softly beneath the tires as I pulled in, and the house looked exactly the way it always had: white siding, dark shutters, and the wide front porch my husband built with his own hands one summer when Daniel was 10 years old. For a moment, I remained in the car with the engine running, watching the sunlight settle across the front yard. The house was quiet in that peaceful way it always became in the afternoon, the kind of silence that does not feel empty but steady. I turned off the engine and carried my purse inside, setting it carefully on the same wooden table near the entry where I placed it every day for years. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee from that morning, and a small stack of unopened mail waited beside the sink. I poured myself a glass of water and stood for a moment at the window that faced the backyard. The grass stretched nearly 80 feet from the porch to the row of trees at the back fence, and the wind moved gently through the branches in a slow rhythm that made the leaves whisper against one another. It was here in this kitchen that most of the phone calls from Daniel had taken place over the past few years. I could picture them clearly now that I allowed myself to remember without distraction. The first one had arrived shortly after Noah started private school. Daniel had explained how wonderful the school was and how much Noah loved the teachers. But the tuition had gone up again and things were a little tight while he and Vanessa were adjusting their budget. I had leaned against this very counter while listening, the phone warm against my ear, and without hesitation, I told him not to worry about it, because family helps each other. A year later, another call came about summer camp, the kind that lasted 2 weeks near the mountains about 150 miles away. Vanessa had said it would be such a meaningful experience for Noah to be around other children who loved science and nature. Again, I had written a check that evening at the same oak table where my husband and I once helped Daniel with his homework. Then there had been the baseball equipment, the new laptop for school, the family trip to Florida. That Vanessa described as an opportunity for Noah to see the ocean for the first time. Each request had been wrapped carefully in appreciation and warm words. And each time I had helped without the smallest trace of doubt, because generosity toward family had always felt like the most natural thing in the world. Standing in the quiet kitchen that afternoon, however, the pattern appeared with a clarity I had never allowed myself to see before. None of those moments had been emergencies. None had required immediate help to prevent something terrible from happening. They had simply been expenses that became easier to manage when someone else quietly stepped forward to cover the difference. I set the empty glass beside the sink and walked into the living room where a photograph of my husband rested on the shelf above the fireplace. In the picture, he was smiling the way he always did when someone took his photo unexpectedly, one eyebrow slightly raised as if amused by the entire idea of posing. For a long moment, I studied the photograph, remembering the practical way he used to approach problems around the house. If a pipe leaked, he fixed a valve. If a board loosened on the porch, he tightened the screws. He believed that small problems only became large ones when people pretended they were not there. The memory brought a quiet smile to my face. I sat down at the desk near the window and opened the small leather notebook where I occasionally wrote reminders and household lists. The page was blank except for the date at the top. I picked up a pen and wrote a single sentence in clear, careful letters. Beginning today, financial help will be planned rather than assumed. The words looked simple on the page, almost ordinary, yet the moment I finished writing them, I felt something inside my chest settle into a calm, steady place. Nothing dramatic had happened. No voices had been raised. No arguments had taken place. But the direction of the future had shifted quietly in that moment. Somewhere across town, Daniel and Vanessa were probably unpacking Noah's gifts and telling him again what a wonderful birthday he had just celebrated. They likely believed the day had unfolded exactly as they expected, and perhaps in their minds it had, because the most important decision made that afternoon had happened miles away. From the restaurant, inside a quiet kitchen where no one else was present to notice the change. The next morning arrived quietly, the way mornings usually do in a house that has spent decades learning how to hold its peace. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen window a little after 7 o'clock, stretching across the wooden floor and stopping just short of the old oak table where I had written that sentence in my notebook the day before. I poured a cup of coffee and sat down with the same calm routine that had shaped most of my mornings since my husband passed away 3 years earlier. Outside, the wind moved slowly through the trees along the fence line, and somewhere in the distance a lawnmower hummed steadily across a neighboring yard. For a while I simply sat there, turning the notebook slightly so the sunlight reached the page where the words still rested in careful ink. Beginning today, financial help will be planned rather than assumed. The sentence looked simple enough, but I knew the quiet weight it carried. For years, generosity had flowed from my life toward Daniel and Vanessa in the same easy direction, like water moving downhill without anyone needing to guide it. What I had written the day before did not mean that love had changed. It meant that direction had. I closed the notebook and reached for my phone just as it began to vibrate softly against the table. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. The timing did not surprise me. It had been my experience that patterns reveal themselves quickly once you begin to notice them. I answered the call with the same warm voice I had always used when speaking to my son. "Good morning, Daniel." His voice sounded relaxed, though I could hear the faint noise of traffic in the background, which meant he was probably driving to the office. "Morning, Mom," he said. "Did you make it home all right yesterday?" I told him I had, and asked whether Noah had enjoyed the rest of his birthday evening. Daniel laughed lightly. He did not want to go to bed, he said. He stayed up until nearly 10 o'clock, opening the rest of his gifts. For a moment, the conversation moved comfortably through the familiar exchange of small details, the kind families share without thinking. Then Daniel cleared his throat in the quiet way people do when they are about to shift a conversation toward its real purpose. "Actually," he said, "I was meaning to talk with you about something Vanessa and I were discussing last night." I remained silent, letting him continue. "You know, Noah's science program at school has been expanding this year," Daniel explained. "They are organizing a special educational trip in the spring. It is supposed to be an incredible opportunity for the kids. Museums, research centers, the whole thing." I listened calmly while he described the program, the travel distance of nearly 200 miles, and the cost involved for each student. His voice remained steady and reasonable, the same tone he had used during every similar conversation over the past few years. When he finished explaining, he added the final sentence with quiet confidence. "We were hoping you might be willing to help cover part of the cost." The request arrived exactly as I expected it would, wrapped in careful language and the promise that the money would support Noah's future. For a moment, I looked out the kitchen window again, watching the sunlight move slowly across the grass behind the house. Then I answered with the same calm voice I had used at the restaurant the day before. "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity for Noah," I said. Daniel paused for half a second, likely expecting the familiar follow-up sentence that had always come next. Instead, I continued, speaking gently. "If you'd like me to help, I will need to see the program details first so we can plan it properly." The silence on the other end of the call lasted slightly longer this time. "Plan it," Daniel repeated. "Yes," I replied. "I have decided to organize my financial help more carefully from now on. That way I can make sure I am supporting the right things at the right time." My tone remained friendly, even reassuring, yet I could hear the faint shift in Daniel's breathing as the meaning of my words settled in. Nothing dramatic had happened. I had not refused. I had simply changed the shape of the conversation. Daniel cleared his throat again before answering. "Well, sure," he said slowly. "I can send you the information later today." "That will be perfect," I replied. We exchanged a few more polite words before ending the call. When I set the phone down on the table, The kitchen felt exactly the same as it had a few minutes earlier. The sunlight still rested across the wooden floor. The coffee was still warm in the cup beside my hand. Yet somewhere across town, Daniel was likely realizing that something subtle had shifted in the rhythm of our family. Because for the first time in many years, the flow of generosity he had come to expect was no longer moving automatically in the same direction. I spent the rest of that afternoon exactly the way I always had, watering the small garden beside the porch and trimming a few branches from the rose bushes that my husband planted years ago. But the difference was not in what I was doing, it was in how clearly my thoughts had begun to arrange themselves. The next few days passed quietly, and I did not bring up money again or mention the conversation with Daniel to anyone. I simply waited. It did not take long. 3 days later, an email arrived from Daniel while I was sitting at the kitchen table after lunch. The subject line read science program information, and the message contained a neatly organized explanation of the school trip he had mentioned. There were details about transportation, hotel accommodations, and a list of museums the students would visit along the way. The cost was clearly written near the bottom of the page, a little over $900 per student once travel and meals were included. I read through the message slowly, taking my time the way I would when reviewing a document for something important. There was nothing unreasonable about the trip itself. It looked like a thoughtful educational program, and I could easily imagine Noah enjoying the experience. When I finished reading, I closed the laptop and sat quietly for a moment. What interested me was not the program. What interested me was the pattern surrounding it, because this time the request had arrived in writing instead of through a casual phone call. It had been organized, explained, and presented in a way that made it appear responsible. That small difference told me something important. Daniel had already noticed the shift in our conversation earlier that week. Later that evening, my phone rang again, just after 6 o'clock, while I was preparing dinner. Vanessa's name appeared on the screen this time. I answered and heard her cheerful voice immediately. "Hello, Evelyn," she said warmly. She did not often call me directly, which meant the reason for the call was already clear before she continued speaking. "Daniel told me he sent the information about the science trip," she said. "It really is a wonderful opportunity for Noah." I agreed politely and told her I had already read through the details. Vanessa sounded pleased to hear that. "The school organizes these programs so carefully," she continued. "It will be such a meaningful experience for the students." I listened calmly while she described how excited Noah had been after hearing about the trip from his teacher. Her voice carried the same bright confidence I had heard at the birthday lunch, the same quiet assumption that everything was unfolding exactly as it should. After a moment, she added the sentence that had clearly been waiting at the end of her explanation. "We were hoping you might be able to cover the full cost since the registration deadline is coming up next week." The request hung in the air for a moment after she finished speaking. I stirred the soup gently on the stove and watched the steam rise in a slow spiral toward the kitchen light. "The program looks excellent," I said. Vanessa sounded relieved when I answered. "I thought you would feel that way," she replied quickly. I allowed a small pause before continuing. "Since we are organizing things more carefully now, I will need to speak with the school directly before making the payment." The silence that followed was subtle but noticeable. Vanessa had expected agreement, not procedure. "Speak with the school?" she repeated. "Yes," I said calmly. "I would like to confirm the details and arrange the payment properly. It is always best to handle these things directly." Vanessa recovered quickly, though I could hear the slight hesitation beneath her cheerful tone. "Of course," she said. "That makes sense." We exchanged a few more polite sentences before ending the call. When I set the phone down, I felt the same quiet certainty I had experienced earlier in the week. Nothing dramatic had happened again. No one had raised their voice. Yet the rhythm of our family conversation had shifted another small step, because Vanessa had just discovered something that neither she nor Daniel had ever needed to consider. Before, helping no longer meant handing over money immediately. Helping now meant asking questions first. And questions have a way of changing the shape of expectations. I called the school the following morning, just after 9 o'clock when the front office opened, and the woman who answered sounded pleasantly surprised that a grandparent was the one asking about the program details. She explained the itinerary carefully, confirming the museums, the travel arrangements, and the hotel where the students would stay during the 2-day trip nearly 200 miles from town. When we reached the part about payment, she paused for a moment and then added something that caught my attention more than anything else she had said. Most families are paying in installments, she explained kindly. The school arranged a schedule, so the cost would not be too difficult all at once. I thanked her for the information and asked if there was any reason the payment had to come from a single person. She answered immediately that it was quite common for parents or relatives to share the cost. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a moment at the kitchen table, looking at the same notebook that still rested beside my coffee cup. The sunlight had moved again across the page, warming the ink where I had written that sentence several days earlier. Beginning today, financial help will be planned rather than assumed. I picked up the phone again and dialed Daniel's number. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, Mom," he said, sounding slightly distracted the way people often do when they are between meetings. "I just spoke with the school," I said calmly. "The trip sounds wonderful." Daniel sounded relieved immediately. "That is great," he replied. "Noah will be really excited." I could hear the expectation already forming in the small pause that followed his words. I continued speaking in the same calm tone. "The office explained that families are sharing the cost in installments this year," I said. Daniel did not answer right away. "Yes," he said slowly after a moment. "I think they mentioned that option." "I believe that is the best approach," I replied gently. "I will cover 1/3 of the cost as my contribution to Noah's trip." The silence that followed lasted nearly 3 full seconds, long enough for both of us to understand the meaning of what I had said. In the past, I would have covered the entire amount without discussion. This time I had simply placed my support beside theirs rather than underneath it. Daniel cleared his throat. 1/3, he repeated quietly. "Yes," I said. "That seems fair for everyone involved." I kept my voice warm and steady, so there could be no misunderstanding about my intention. I was still helping. I was simply no longer doing it alone. Daniel eventually answered with a polite sentence about discussing the remaining cost with Vanessa later that evening. We ended the call the same way we always did, with calm voices and ordinary goodbyes. Later that afternoon, Vanessa called me again. Her tone remained polite, but the brightness I had heard during our earlier conversations was softer now, as if she were carefully choosing each word. "Daniel mentioned you spoke with the school," she said. I told her I had and explained that I would be sending my portion of the payment directly to the office that afternoon. Vanessa thanked me, though the gratitude sounded measured rather than enthusiastic. "We will arrange the rest," she added after a moment. "That sounds perfect," I replied. When the call ended, the kitchen felt exactly as peaceful as it had the day before. Nothing in the room had changed. The window still faced the same stretch of backyard grass. The notebook still rested on the table beside my coffee cup. Yet somewhere across town, Daniel and Vanessa were now facing a new reality that had never existed before. For the first time since Noah began school, the responsibility for his opportunities was being shared instead of quietly transferred. I mailed the payment later that afternoon and then walked out to the garden to water the roses again. The air smelled of warm earth and sunlight, and the breeze moved gently across the yard the way it always had. I did not feel angry with Daniel or Vanessa. In fact, the only feeling that remained was a quiet sense of balance, finally returning to a place where it had been missing for a long time. Because generosity is still generosity when it is offered with wisdom. And sometimes the most important change in a family does not happen with raised voices or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it begins the moment someone decides that kindness will continue, but expectations will no longer decide its direction.